All right, what's going on, everybody? So today we are discussing what I would consider to be the first really big topic of this financial sector, right? We started with money, what it does, what's the certain roles of money, what are the types of money, right? Kind of just give us a little foundation. But today we're going to talk about, well, how is money created, right? And what is the banking system set up to do? Um, and what does it look like, right? So this is kind of what we're going to call, this is our fractional reserve banking system. And I'll show you exactly what that means, right? But this goes right in hand with the savings equals investment, right? That you put money into a bank and that becomes somebody else's investment through the form of a loan that the bank gives out, right? So we're going to have to create a lot of T accounts or bank balance sheets, right? And show a little bit about money creation. So we're going to set that all out today, right? And make sure that you know how to do that. All right, so if we start here, this is a T account, right? We got left assets, right liabilities. We'll always set it up like that. And remember that this is a bank's T account, right? This isn't your T account, right? So make sure you understand we create these for banks, okay? First big idea is that assets and liabilities, they have to equal each other. That's why we call it a balance sheet, right? So if there's $10,000 in liabilities, there's $10,000 in assets, and it has to be like that, right? There cannot be a dispute, $10,000 in liabilities and $9,000 in assets, right? Can't have that, right? So they're equal to each other. Now, what we'll see here is kind of break down what's in each, what's most important to us in each of these columns. All right, so let's start on the right. Let's start with liabilities, right? So for a bank, what is a liability? Well, a liability for anybody is something that they owe, right? For a bank, what that means is, well, who do they owe? They owe the people who have deposited money into their bank, right? You go to a bank and you deposit $1,000. That is not the bank's money, right? You, at any point, can go to the bank and say, hey, I'd like my $1,000 back. And they are liable to give it back to you, all right? So that is the number one liability. In fact, it's really the only liability that we care about in our T accounts, all right? They're called demand deposits, right? Money that individuals put into the bank in exchange for checkable deposits, right? Basically a checking account, okay? Once again, bank, right? If you want your money back, they are liable to give it to you. It's money that they owe to you. All right. So that's liabilities. Now, on the asset side, what are assets? Well, for a bank, for anybody, assets are things that people owe to them, right? Or things that can be sold for some kind of money value. So for a bank, remember, banks are businesses. The bottom line is that banks compete for your money, and they need to make money. Right? They're not just in the business of holding on to your checkings account so that you can come back and get it. But they're trying to make money, and they do it through creating money, right? And how they do that is through loans. All right, that's the bottom line. So assets for a bank that we are most concerned about are loans, right? But how do they provide loans, right? That's what we really care about. So this is where we get into our fractional reserve banking system, right? And why we call it fractional reserves is because there's two types of reserves, right? First one on our asset side is called required reserves. We will be given a ratio, right, that the bank has to hold a certain amount of money in relation to demand deposits, right? This is money that they cannot lend out, right? So if you go into the Bank of Berwyn here, you deposit $1,000, and the Federal Reserve, the central bank, tells all this Bank of Berwyn that required reserve ratio is 10%, right? So 10% of your demand deposits you are not allowed to loan out. So that means that this bank has to hold on to $100, right? They have to keep that in their vault, cannot be loaned out. The reason they have to do that is because, well, if you or anybody else who went to this bank decides they want to go to the bank and pull out some money from their account, the bank has to have it for them, right? It has to say, yeah, here you go, right? And that's what that required reserves ratio is for. It's to hold money in case people do want to take out their money, right? So that's the first part of reserves, right? Now, the rest of that money that you put in is called excess reserves, right? Here's our fractional reserve, right? Required and excess. And what we'll see is this excess reserves, this is the key to money creation, all right? More excess reserves, more money creation, right? So, excess reserves is everything that's left after we held on to what we're required, right? And then this is the money that can be loaned out, right? So if we go back to our example of demand deposits, you put $1,000 in, bank is required to hold 10% of that, so they're holding 100, can't loan that out. The rest of it, $900, that is money that they can be lent out in the form of new loans. And that's how the bank makes money, right? That's how they make money as a business. And that's how money is created in the economy, all right? All through this idea that excess reserves can be loaned out to other people, all right? Now, when we look at our T accounts, these are the big things, like 1, 2, 3, boom, right? Demand deposits, how much has to be reserved, required to be reserved, how much can be loaned out, lent out, right? But you will see a couple other things on these balance sheets, all right? So on assets side, you'll often see stuff like loans, bonds, and securities. Understand that if you see these, right, so $10,000 in loans, that is money that's already loaned out or lent out. You cannot change that amount, right? You cannot recall loans that quick, right? So a bank, if they lend out $10,000, cannot immediately say, hey, we need our $10,000 back, right? So this money is gone, right? It's lent out. It is what it is. It's in the form of assets, okay? The other thing you'll see that I'm going to tell you right now you should just ignore is equity. The only time they'll put this in there is in order to balance out this sheet if they have to, right? So say there's like $10,000 in assets and there's $9,000 in demand deposits. They'll just put like $1,000 in equity just to balance the two sides out. You can just ignore it, right? Equity is ownership, like shareholders ownership that you have to pay out as a bank, but you really don't worry about it, right? You see that, ignore it. It means nothing to us, okay? So let's go through this, and you're gonna have to kind of break down a balance sheet, but let's see how money is created. Okay, so we've got this Bank of Berwyn, and we'll just literally take that example that I just gave you, right? Required reserve ratio is 10%. You deposit $1,000 into the Bank of Berwyn. How much of that is required by the Bank of Berwyn to be held by them in their vault, not lent out? 10% of that, all right? So find the required reserve ratio is the second part, $100. Everything else is excess reserves of that $1,000. Everything else can be lent out, $900, okay? So there you go, we set it up, right? Now, where money creation comes in is that this $900 will be lent out to somebody, right? And all of a sudden, somebody who didn't have $900 now has it, right? The bank didn't print any money. They took your money and gave it to somebody else, right? And that's how money is created, right? So say like you put $1,000 in, I go to your bank, right? I'm looking for a bank for a loan, right? And I say, I want a loan for whatever, it doesn't really matter, a new house, right? It doesn't have, it's obviously not a good house, but it doesn't matter, right? Your bank is going to give me the $900, which is actually your money, right? That's your savings, but it turns into being my investment to buy something else, right? So the bank says, sure, right, we'll give you a loan for $900, right? They give me a check, right, for $900. I then deposit that check into my bank, Wayne Bank, right? That becomes a liability for Wayne Bank. They owe me $900, right? But what do they do with that? Well, they split it. They fraction it into two reserves, right? 10% has to be held by them in their vault, so $90. $810 can be lent out to them or lent out to somebody else. And that's what will happen. They'll find somebody who needs a loan for $810 and they'll send it to them, right? This is the creation of money without ever having to print money. It just started with $1,000 that you put in to the bank. They lent out $900 of yours. It's almost like I now, right, we together have $1,900. You see this? $1,900. But the only actual amount that was deposited, or like physical money, was $1,000, right? And then that's how we create this money, okay? So you could continue this on from 810, loan out to somebody else. What's the required? What's the excess reserves? That's then lent out, right? And we can figure out how much your $1,000, how much money it actually created. But there's a quicker way to do that, right? You don't have to go through all of that. So this is how we look at that, and it's called the money multiplier. Right? Just like we had a spending multiplier, just like we had a tax multiplier, we have a money multiplier. Right? And this tells us the total amount of new money that's created in a banking system from the addition of a new dollar into deposits. All right? So that money multiplier has to know this equation, 1 divided by your required reserve ratio. Right? So our required reserve ratio is 10% in that question. So 1 divided by 0.1 equals 10. Right? So if we look at this problem, we can find a whole bunch of different things. And what becomes very apparent for us is that higher required reserve ratios mean less creation of money, or it drops the money supply. Right? Lower required reserve ratios increase money supply, creates more money. Right? So if we look at this, assume $1,000 is deposited in the bank. Each bank loans out all of their reserves. Right? For each of the following ratios, calculate the amount the bank must hold in required reserves, amount that they can lend out in excess, the multiplier, and then how much the money supply could increase. All right. So $1,000, if our required reserve ratio is 1%, right? They are required to hold on to $10, right, in their vault. They can loan out the rest, so they can loan out $990. Our multiplier, 1 divided by 0.01, would be 100, right? So what we would do, and this is key here, right? How much the money supply increases, we take the excess reserves amount and we times that by the multiplier, all right? So don't take this 1,000, all right? That's a different problem, and we'll show that in just a second. All right, money supply increases by how much the bank can initially loan out, $900, times your multiplier, creation of money, $99,000 created off of that $1,000 deposit. All right, and then same thing here, because you have 5% reserve ratio, bank has to hold on to $50, can loan out the rest, $950. 1 divided by 0.05 is 20. 950 times 20, creation of money, $19,000. And then this was our example, 10%, right? Required reserves 100, loan out 900. 1 divided by 0.1, 10 for our multiplier, 900 times 10, money created is $9,000 off of that $1,000 deposit, all right? So it's going to be key for us, because this is going to come into hand when we talk about monetary policy and what the Federal Reserve does. Higher required reserve ratios drop the money, there's a lower money supply. If the central bank decides to lower the required reserve ratio, they can increase the money supply, right? And we see that here. See the difference between required reserves of 1% and 10%. Right? $99,000 created in the form of new loans, right? That's what's crazy about that. Right? $99,000 in the form of new loans is created from a $1,000 deposit when the required reserve ratio is 1. Right? So, one big thing, and I just briefly mentioned that in this past one. This is a really important detail. You're going to get questions like this, and they will tend to trick people up. All right? There is a difference between new loans, new money, and new demand deposits in a banking situation, a multiplier situation. Right? The question can read one of two things. What is the change in new deposits from an initial $1,000 deposit, and what is the change in the money supply? Okay, so I'll show this question in just a second, right? But that's the key. If you see a change in deposits, what we do with a change in deposit is we include the new deposit, right? So that'd be that $1,000 that starts the lending cycle. So we take that $1,000 and we times it by the multiplier, right? And we'd find, in our question, $1,000 times 10, the change in new deposits would then be $10,000, all right? But if the question asks what is the change in the money supply, we only take the excess reserves, right? We don't include the new deposit, right? Because the excess reserves is what we can loan out, right? And that's what the money supply is all about. So we take the excess reserves, times it by the multiplier, all right? So big point there, right? That first round of lending, right, is just a transfer of M1, right? No new money is being created by you putting $1,000 into the bank. Right? If we think about M1, right, and it being currency and demand deposits, you depositing $1,000, right, $1,000 in cash put into demand deposits, there's no change in money supply there, right? It's just one idea of M1 into the other, right? So there's no creation of new money. So the money supply kicks in when we think about that first lending of excess reserves, all right? So let's look at that problem, all right? Let's look at some of that idea, all right? So here's your problem. All right, read it, pause for a second, see if you can tackle these, okay? And then just if you're struggling, unpause and we'll jump right into it. All right, so here's our question. Assume that the reserve requirement is 20% and banks hold no excess reserves, meaning any excess reserves they have, they lend it all out, okay? Assume that Kim deposits $100 of cash from her pocket into her checking account, okay? By the way, that's no creation of money, right? Nothing happened in the creation of money there, right? She already had $100. That was M1. She's just putting into her checking account. It's just a transfer of M1 to M1. So no new money created yet, all right? Calculate each of the following. Maximum dollar amount the commercial bank can initially lend, all right? Well, the required reserve ratio is 20%. They have to hold 20% of 100, all right? So that means they have to hold $20 and they can loan out the rest, right? So excess reserves, $80, and that's what they can lend out, right? Number two, maximum total change, and here it is, demand deposits in the banking system. When you see that change in demand deposits, we take the $100 and times it by the money multiplier. All right, we take the entire deposit. Money multiplier, 1 divided by 0.2, the required reserve ratio, 5. Right? Take the entire deposit, 5 times 100, and the change in demand deposits is $500, right? Now the change in money supply, right? Money supply, we can only take what the excess reserves, what the initial lending was, all right? So we know that the initial amount lent out was $80, times that by the multiplier of 5, and you get the change in money supply is $400, all right? So we'll do another problem in just a second, but I want to point out this right here. So this is a disclaimer that the problem offers. There's no excess reserves, and the reason they do that is because there can be a leakage from the money multiplier. The idea that the maximum possible change may not actually come to fruition. And it's in two ways. One, people hold new loans in the form of cash, right? That loan that went to me, I don't deposit it all. All of a sudden, money's being withheld from the bank, right? So that $900 loan that I got way back in that first problem, I hold on to whatever $100, and then I'm only depositing $800, right? And all of a sudden, that's just skews what the multiplier could have been, right? It makes it less, right? That's that leakage from the multiplier. The second one, banks do not lend out all their excess reserves, right? So that first, they don't loan me 900 or the 900 that they could have from your deposit. You know, they only loan out 700 and they're just holding on to 200, right? That is also a leakage from the money multiplier. The multiplier is, the money supply can't grow as much as it would, all right? So make sure you know those. Those tend to come up in free response questions about an explanation of how might the money multiplier not be that large, right? So let's end this one with a question, all right? So here is once again that liability, that asset T account, right? They're equal, $1,000 in liabilities, demand deposits, 10% required reserve ratio, $100 in required reserves, $900 in excess reserves. 5 questions. Pause it, go ahead and answer them, and we'll stop there. All right, so number 1, initial effect of the $1,000 deposit on the measure of the M1 money supply. All right, this is a question that trips people up, but did your $1,000 deposit change M1, right? Knowing that M1 is any classification of money that you can buy something with right now. Well, you had $1,000 in cash. You just put it into your checking account. Nothing happened with M1, right? That $1,000 just basically transferred from circulation to checking, right? So there's no change, right? It's a transfer of equal amounts between M1 components, right? Nothing happened, right? So that question will be asked a lot. Make sure you understand that you depositing money into a checking account does absolutely nothing to the money supply because that money was already out there, right? Number 2, what is the maximum dollar amount the bank can initially lend? Well, the bank can lend out all of their excess reserves, right? So $900, right? Cannot loan out their required reserves. They have to hold on to that. Number 3, maximum total change in demand deposits in the banking system. All right, well, you needed to find your money multiplier. Money multiplier was 1 divided by your required reserve ratio of 0.1, so 10. Change in demand deposits, we take the initial demand deposit of $1,000 and we times it by your multiplier, right? And there's your $10,000, right, in new demand deposits. And then number 4, the maximum change in the money supply. All right, now the question is money supply. How does that change? All right, so we need to only take the $900 that the bank can loan out and times that by our multiplier. So the change in money supply is 9,000. And then number 5, what is a reason the money supply may not increase to that $9,000, which would be the maximum potential? 2 things, right? People do not deposit all their money in the bank, or that banks hold on to some excess reserves and do not loan it all out, all right? So that is a T account. That shows that money creation. We got a little required reserves, money multiplier in there. Make sure you can kind of work through that. Know the difference between change in demand deposits, change in money supply. And we'll do a lot of problems with this as we continue on. All right.